June 22, 1976. 10 p.m. A doctor from the Canary Islands is traveling by taxi along dark roads to attend to an emergency. Suddenly, after a curve, his testimony was filed in a 97-page military record. What he saw that night was also witnessed by the crew of a Spanish Navy Corvette, hundreds of civilians on 5 different islands, and was reported in the press the following day. But here's the disturbing part: the Spanish Air Force investigated the case for months and reached an official conclusion. Decades later, when the file was declassified, that conclusion changed completely. This is the story of the 1976 Canary Islands incident. A case where military witnesses, official documentation, and scientific explanations intertwine with one of the most detailed testimonies in Spanish ufology. And it all began on a road in Galder, when a doctor saw something that defied all logic. When we talk about UFO sightings, most end up being misunderstandings, misinterpretations, or outright fabrications. But every now and then a case comes along that is different. The Canary Islands incident of June 22, 1976, is one such case. Not because it lacks explanation, it does have one, but because the way it unfolded, the people involved, and what actually happened that night raise fascinating questions about perception, reality, and how we interpret the unknown. We are in the Canary Islands, a Spanish archipelago in the Atlantic, about 100 kilometers off the African coast. June 1976. Spain is in the midst of its democratic transition following Franco's death 7 months earlier. The country is experiencing a time of political uncertainty, rapid change, and yes, also military secrecy inherited from the dictatorship. In this context, something extraordinary is going to happen. And it will be witnessed by enough credible people that the Ministry of Defense cannot simply ignore it. To understand this case, we need to place ourselves in the historical moment. It is June 1976. Juan Carlos I has been king of Spain for barely 7 months. The prime minister is Carlos Arias Navarro, a politician from the previous regime who is trying to maintain the Francoist status quo. The tension is palpable. Terrorist groups like ETA are increasing their attacks, there are pro-democracy demonstrations, and the country is divided between those who want change and those who cling to the past. 9 days after our incident, King Juan Carlos will force Arias Navarro's resignation and appoint Adolfo Suarez, marking the true beginning of the transition. But that hasn't happened yet. Furthermore, we are in the midst of the Cold War. Distrust of the unknown, especially anything that could be military or foreign, is at its peak. The protagonists. In Gran Canaria lives a doctor named Francisco Julio Padrón Leon. He is a respected professional in Galder, a municipality in the north of the island. A serious, hard-working man, one of those small-town doctors who are available at any hour. On the night of June 22, Dr. Padrón received an emergency call. He was needed in Piso Firme, a rural area, to attend to a patient. He called a taxi driven by Francisco Estevez, and together with Damaso Diaz, a relative of the patient, they set off. It's just after 10 p.m. The sun set hours ago. The roads are dark, illuminated only by taxi headlights. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, the Spanish Navy Corvette Atrevida sails parallel to Fuerteventura. It's a routine patrol. The crew isn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. On land, hundreds of people on different islands are ending their day. Some are looking at the sky, others are at home. Nobody knows that in minutes, they will all witness the same phenomenon. 9:27 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. 10:27 p.m. local time in the Canary Islands. The officers on watch aboard the Corvette Atrevida are on deck. It is a clear night, perfect visibility. Suddenly, one of them points towards the horizon. Something is emerging. The Corvette's captain would later describe what they saw, an intense, bluish-yellow light that seemed to emerge from the ground and rise into the sky. It's not an airplane. It doesn't behave like an airplane. The light slowly rises until it reaches between 15 and 18 degrees above the horizon. And then, it stops. It hangs suspended in the air, projecting a gigantic luminous halo that illuminates the night sky. The phenomenon is so bright that the crew can see it with perfect clarity. And it stays there. 40 minutes. The crew watches, puzzled. They record the time, the position, the characteristics of the phenomenon. Because they know this will be in an official report. At the same time, from Gran Canaria, Tenerife, La Palma, La Gomera and Fuerteventura, hundreds of people are watching the same celestial spectacle. Show, map with islands and observation points. In Granadilla and Tacoronte, local newspapers are receiving urgent phone calls. Correspondents report seeing something strange in the sky over La Palma. A sergeant on patrol at Pozo de las Nieves sees it. A town hall employee in Llanos de Aridane sees it. Sailors on the Japanese freighter Osaka Bay, 400 kilometers south of La Gomera, see it. Passengers on the ferry Villa de Aguit see it. They all describe the same thing, a luminous, bright sphere, with yellow and blue colors, that remains motionless in the sky. But nobody describes what Dr. Padrón is about to see. The taxi moves along the dark road. Dr. Padrón is in the passenger seat, Damaso Diaz in the back. Francisco Estevez, the taxi driver, keeps the headlights on high to see the road better. They're probably talking about mundane things. The medical emergency. Work. Normal stuff. Then, after a bend, the taxi almost came to a complete stop. Suspended above a field of onions, about 60 meters away, is a sphere. But it's not the sphere that hundreds of people are seeing from other parts of the Canary Islands. Not according to Dr. Padrón. This sphere is here. Close. Tangible. The testimony of Dr. Padrón. The doctor would later describe the sphere as being about 30 meters in diameter. It was transparent, so transparent that he could see the stars through it. But within that transparency there was something impossible. Two figures. Bright red in color. Tall, almost 3 meters high. And they were manipulating what looked like a large console, full of controls. Below the sphere, jets of bluish gas were coming out, as if it were being kept suspended by some kind of propulsion. Dr. Padrón watches this for what must seem like an eternity. The taxi driver, Francisco Estevez, also sees it, though he later offers fewer details. In the back seat, Damaso Diaz has curled up in a ball and refuses to look. And so, the doctor has to do his duty. There's a patient waiting. They get out of the taxi. Dr. Padrón enters the house to attend to the emergency. But from the window, while he works, he can see how the sphere begins to slowly rise, shining with those bluish tones, until it disappears into the night sky. What did he really see? This is where this case becomes fascinating from a psychological and perceptual point of view. Because let's think about this, at that very moment, the entire Canary Islands is seeing a light in the sky. A light being observed from the Corvette Atrevida, which has officers trained in object identification. A light being photographed by tourists. A light that will appear in all the newspapers the next day. But Dr. Padrón does not describe a distant light. Nearby, detailed object with beings inside. Did he see the same thing as everyone else, but his mind interpreted it as something close? Or was there really something more, something local, besides the phenomenon that everyone saw? This question will haunt researchers for decades. June 23, the day after. The next day, June 23, 1976, the Canary Islands newspapers exploded. El Dia reports, around 10:30 at night, this newsroom received several phone calls from our correspondents in Granadilla and Tacoronte reporting a phenomenon they were observing over the island of La Palma. The province reports, a strange object was sighted from different points across our region, especially in the Galder and Telda area. The calls are overwhelming newsrooms. Everyone wants to know, what was that? On June 25, 2 days after the event, Dr. Padrón's testimony was published in detail. And that's when the case ceased to be lights in the sky, and became something far more extraordinary. Because seeing strange lights is one thing. It's quite another for a respected doctor to claim to have seen beings inside a spacecraft. When there are enough witnesses, especially military personnel, the protocol is clear: official investigation. The Air Force opens case file 760622. A military judge is appointed to lead the investigation. And it's not a superficial investigation. They're going to interview witnesses. They're going to collect written testimonies. They're going to analyze every detail. 97-page report. 97 pages of testimonies, analyses, diagrams, and calculations. It is one of the most complete UFO dossiers ever produced by the Spanish Armed Forces. But there's an awkward detail. The day after the incident, someone reported that the onion field where the sphere supposedly landed was burned, as if something extremely hot had been there. The news is spreading. Ufologists are excited. Physical evidence. Except no. When investigators examined the field, they discovered that someone had intentionally burned it after the incident. It was a hoax, likely perpetrated by someone seeking attention or trying to help the case. Alejandro Carlos de Jorcos, a paranormal investigator who initially studied the case, takes samples of the terrain. He finds nothing anomalous. Nothing to suggest that anything extraordinary was there. In fact, Jorcos ends up skeptical of Dr. Padrón's entire testimony. He even goes so far as to think it might have been a joke that got out of hand. The official conclusion of 1976. After months of investigation, the military judge reaches his conclusion. What happened was a FANI, Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon. They couldn't determine its physical nature because the island's radars detected nothing. None. Despite hundreds of people witnessing the phenomenon, despite it lasting more than 40 minutes, the radar systems registered no object. There is a particularly revealing line in the report. The investigator notes that he is debating whether to accept the doctor's statement, believing that the witnesses narrated what their minds made them see, influencing each other. And that's where the case stands. Filed. Classified. An unsolved mystery. Until 1994. On July 13, 1994, Spain declassified 80 UFO files from the Air Force. These 1,900 pages detail cases investigated between 1962 and 1995. File 760622, our case from the Canary Islands, is among them. And when civilian researchers finally gain access to all the documentation, something changes. Because now they have access to information that wasn't available in 1976. The explanation, Poseidon. A new assessment appears in the declassified pages. SLBM Poseidon C-3 missile, US Navy, USA. Wait. Missiles? It turns out that a researcher named Ricardo Campo Perez, a PhD in philosophy specializing in ufology, became obsessed with this case. He spent years collecting data, comparing testimonies, and analyzing trajectories. And then he contacted international experts. Claude Poer, head of the Rocket Probe Division at the French National Center for Space Studies. Dr. D.G. Kinghele, a world authority on satellites at the British Ministry of Defense. And crucially, Jonathan McDowell, Ph.D. in astrophysics from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. McDowell had an exhaustive database of space and military launches. And he found something specific. On June 22, 1976, the U.S. submarine USS von Steuben launched two C-3 Poseidon missiles from the Atlantic. The launch time, exactly when the sightings began in the Canary Islands. How does the explanation work? Poseidon missiles were submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Designed to carry nuclear warheads, although in this case they were tests, they did not carry live weapons. When one of these missiles is launched, it ascends to altitudes of 46 to 90 kilometers. At that altitude, the missile expels propellant gases. And here's the key. For the inhabitants of the Canary Islands, it was night. The sun had set at 7:10 p.m. But at an altitude of 90 kilometers, those gases were still being illuminated by the sun. Imagine this, you're in the dark, looking up at the sky. Suddenly, you see a giant sphere of glowing gas, illuminated by a sun you can no longer see, creating halos of yellow and blue hues. It seems to float motionless because it's so far away, hundreds of kilometers distant. Subsequent calculations established that the phenomenon was located approximately 762 to 1062 kilometers west of the Canary Islands. That's why the radars didn't detect anything. Because there was nothing near the islands. The phenomenon was hundreds of kilometers away, in international waters. But, what about Dr. Padrón? This is where psychology becomes fascinating. Ricardo Campo, after all his research, concluded something important: the descriptions provided are typical of missile launches. I believe the doctor's perceptual effect gave him the impression of seeing it there, but I have testimonies from all over the Canary Islands that the sphere was over the sea, it never landed in Galder. It is a phenomenon known in psychology called pareidolia, when a stimulus is mistakenly perceived as a familiar but unreal pattern. Dr. Padrón saw the same giant sphere as everyone else. But his brain, trying to make sense of something extraordinary, interpreted it as something familiar. And once his mind constructed that interpretation, it filled in the details, the beings, the console, the transparency. The taxi driver, influenced by the doctor, partially confirmed the story. But Damaso Diaz, the rear passenger, saw nothing except a distant glow. They were all looking at the same thing. But their minds processed it in radically different ways. So what really happened on the night of June 22, 1976? We know for certain that hundreds of people on 5 different islands witnessed an extraordinary luminous phenomenon. We know it lasted more than 40 minutes. We know it was remarkable enough for trained military personnel to officially report it. And now we know, with documentary evidence, that the US Navy launched 2 Poseidon missiles at exactly that time, in exactly that area. The scientific explanation is sound. Not perfect, no explanation is perfect when we're talking about human perception, but sound. But there is something this case teaches us beyond missiles and illuminated gases. It shows us how fragile our perception of reality can be. A respected doctor, a scientifically trained professional, saw something and interpreted it in a specific way. He wasn't lying. He wasn't seeking fame. In fact, according to some accounts, he tried to remain silent for years. He simply saw something extraordinary and his human mind tried to make sense of it. This case remains one of the most studied in Spanish ufology. Ricardo Campo dedicated years to investigating it and published a 372-page book solely on this incident. The declassified file is available online for anyone who wants to read it. The original testimonies, the military reports, it's all there. And that's what's fascinating: even with all the available information, even knowing what likely caused the phenomenon, the case continues to generate debate. Because it touches on something fundamental to human nature. We want there to be mystery. We want there to be something beyond the known. And perhaps, just perhaps, that night in June 1976, hundreds of Canary Islanders briefly experienced that feeling of being in front of something impossible, even if it was only the reflection of the sun on the gases of a missile hundreds of kilometers away. Sometimes reality is extraordinary enough without adding extraterrestrials. But I'll leave that for you to decide. And that is the complete story of the 1976 Canary Islands UFO incident. One of the most documented, most studied, and most revealing cases of how human perception works when we are faced with the unknown. What do you think? Did Dr. Padrón really see something more? Or was it an extraordinary case of how our mind can transform a real phenomenon into something completely different? Leave your opinion in the comments. And if these kinds of cases fascinate you as much as they do me, subscribe because more equally intriguing stories are coming soon. See you in the next episode.